Blackfoot ambush. Isaac Rose's poisoned arrow survival, 1836. 3 bullet holes, one through his hat, one grazing his chest, and one shattering his right elbow. Isaac Rose collapsed in the snow as Blackfoot poison coursed through his veins. His heart rate doubled. His companions dropped 60 pounds of buffalo meat in the snow, buying precious seconds as their pursuers stopped to collect it. Subscribe now to Histories and Native Tales and uncover how Rose survived an encounter with warriors from a tribe that controlled 1,000 lodges and dominated the northern plains through strategic violence against trespassers. The winter of 1836 gripped Montana with merciless ferocity. 4 miles from Clark's Fork on the Yellowstone River, Isaac P. Rose tossed restlessly in his buffalo hide bedroll. Temperatures had plummeted to 20 degrees below zero. The young fur trapper's breath crystallized in the frigid air. As he startled awake from a dream so vivid, it sent chills through his body that had nothing to do with the bitter cold. Rose sat up, his heart pounding. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to reveal his 3 companions, Joe Meek, Jack Larison, and Mark Head, still deep in sleep. The 4 men had separated from Jim Bridger's main party 3 days earlier, volunteering to replenish dwindling food supplies. 30 miles away, their starving comrades waited, their survival hanging by an increasingly thin thread as winter tightened its grip on the wilderness. So far, the hunting party had enjoyed unexpected success. 4 of their 8 horses stood tethered nearby, laden with fresh buffalo meat, enough to feed Bridger's men for at least 2 weeks. But Rose couldn't shake the lingering unease from his dream. As dawn broke, Rose stirred the coals and added kindling to revive the fire. Joe Meek rolled over, squinting at his companion's troubled expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Rose," Meek remarked, reaching for his powder horn. Rose hesitated before speaking. "Had the strangest dream. A massive grizzly, biggest I've ever seen, stood up on its hind legs right in front of me. Dreaming of bears in winter." Larison snorted, now awake and listening. "They're all hibernating, you fool." "This wasn't just any bear," Rose continued. "This one spoke to me, called me by name. Then it reached out its paw." Rose demonstrated with his right hand. "I offered my left hand, but the bear refused it, insisted on shaking my right hand instead." Meek's expression shifted from amusement to concern. He set down his coffee tin and leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You better look out, Rose, or you'll shake hands with Be a Lab before night." "Be a Lab?" asked Markhead, the youngest of the group, who had been silent until now. "Blackfoot," Meek explained grimly. "That's what we call him, Be a Lab." The word hung in the air like the morning mist, chilling the men more effectively than the Montana winter. For fur trappers like them, no threat loomed larger than the Blackfoot tribe. Not grizzlies, not rattlesnakes, not wolves or mountain lions. Not flash floods, avalanches, or forest fires. The Blackfoot were the shadow that haunted their every move through these territories. "You think my dream's some kind of warning?" Rose asked, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. Meek nodded solemnly. "Dreams speak truths we can't always see in daylight. The Blackfoot are everywhere in these parts, especially in winter." The fur trappers knew well the history of the people they feared. The Blackfoot had migrated from the northeast, near present-day Maine and Canada, centuries earlier. They'd moved through the Great Lakes region before settling in the plains of Alberta and Montana. Unlike other tribes who had obtained horses directly from Spanish sources, the Blackfoot's northern position delayed their acquisition of these transformative animals. Before horses, they'd hunted buffalo by driving them off cliffs in elaborate, coordinated hunts. But once mounted, the Blackfoot became the undisputed masters of the northern plains. Their territory expanded, their hunting efficiency multiplied, and their capacity for warfare became legendary. 3 hunting parties disappeared just last month. Larison reminded them, checking his rifle. All within 50 miles of where we sit right now. Head nervously, scanned the tree line surrounding their camp. How many warriors in a typical Blackfoot war party? 8 to 12, usually. Meek answered, his eyes now constantly moving between the forest and the horizon. Though I've heard of war parties with 20 or more, when they're determined to eliminate a specific threat. In winter, the Blackfoot typically moved into wooded river valleys, where trees provided both shelter from bitter winds and fuel for fires. Here they continued hunting buffalo animals that represented far more than mere sustenance. For the Blackfoot, buffalo provided everything. Meat for food, hides for teepees, bones for tools, sinew for bowstrings, horns for ladles, bladders for water containers. More importantly, the buffalo was sacred, a divine gift from the Creator that sustained their entire way of life. Any outsiders who hunted buffalo on Blackfoot territory committed not just trespassing, but sacrilege. The punishment was clear and unwavering. Death. We've taken 17 buffalo in 3 days, Rose said quietly, the implications of his words sinking in. That's 17 reasons for the Blackfoot to want our scalps. The men fell silent, the weight of their situation settling upon them like the thick blanket of snow that covered the landscape. The 4 horses shifted nervously, as if sensing the men's growing unease. 2 feet of snow made travel slow and arduous. Their tracks would be easy to follow. Maybe we should head back to Bridger today, Head suggested, his voice cracking slightly. Meek nodded. Your dream bear might have done us a favor, Rose. Best not ignore such warnings in Blackfoot country. Rose touched his right arm unconsciously, remembering the strange handshake from his dream. Little did he know that within 24 hours, that same arm would be pierced by a Blackfoot arrow, and the inexplicable dream would take on an entirely new significance. Despite their misgivings, the 4 trappers decided to hunt one final day before returning to Bridger's camp. The sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge when Rose, the most skilled marksman among them, spotted a small herd of buffalo grazing 2 miles north. Under normal circumstances, approaching these animals required patience and skill, but not extraordinary difficulty for experienced hunters. Yet today, something was different. Rose crept within 300 yards of the nearest buffalo, still too far for an accurate shot with his Hawken rifle. The massive beasts lifted their heads, nostrils flaring, then abruptly thundered away before he could close the distance. This pattern repeated itself 5 more times over the next 2 hours. Each buffalo herd, they located over 300 animals, in total displayed an unusual wariness that prevented Rose from getting within effective shooting range. This abnormal behavior triggered immediate alarm among the seasoned mountain men. Buffalo simply didn't act this skittish naturally. The animals' heightened alertness pointed to one conclusion. Human hunters had been actively pursuing them. In this territory, that meant Blackfoot presence. Meek pointed to fresh tracks in the snow near a copse of cottonwoods. 6 distinct sets of moccasin prints, partially obscured by the previous night's light snowfall. The 4 trappers exchanged knowing glances. Rose had barely regained his strength when a new crisis erupted at Bridger's camp. Within minutes, they had packed their meager camp and begun traveling southeast toward Bridger's party. Their 4 horses heavily laden with the 17 buffalo they had managed to kill over the previous days. The terrain slowed their progress considerably. 2 feet of crusted snow blanketed the rolling hills, forcing them to zigzag through the landscape rather than travel in a direct line. Each horse carried approximately 60 pounds of meat, precious cargo they were reluctant to abandon despite the danger. By midday, they had covered only 7 miles. The attack came without warning as they approached a small ravine between 2 hills. One moment, the trappers were picking their way carefully down a gentle slope. The next, 8 Blackfoot warriors erupted from behind a snow-covered outcropping 30 yards ahead. Their war cries shattered the winter silence as they fired their first volley. Rose, who led the party, became the primary target. He yanked his horse around, but the animal had barely begun to turn when the air filled with the distinctive crack of musket fire. 3 lead balls found their mark in the span of 2 seconds. One bullet pierced Rose's hat, whistling past his ear, close enough to feel its heat. Another tore across his chest, leaving a jagged but shallow laceration that severed his ammunition pouch, sending the vital item plummeting into the snow. A third shot penetrated his buckskin glove, grazing his wrist without causing serious damage. The fourth shot proved devastating. A Blackfoot musket ball struck Rose's right elbow, entering just above the joint and exiting through his forearm. Bone fragments exploded outward as the bullet destroyed the joint, rendering his arm instantly useless. Searing pain shot through Rose's body as his horse panicked from the gunfire and the scent of blood. The frantic animal bolted down the ravine. His rifle slid from his lap, disappearing into the snow. In the chaos that followed, the other trappers scattered in different directions. Rose, now weaponless, except for his hunting knife and tomahawk, clung to his horse with his functioning left arm. Blood soaked through his buckskin jacket, leaving a crimson trail in the snow. Behind him, Jack Larison made a split-second decision that likely saved all their lives. Recognizing the impossibility of outrunning Blackfoot warriors while weighed down with meat, Larison drew his knife and slashed the bindings securing the buffalo packages to his horse. 60 pounds of fresh meat tumbled onto the snowy plain. Head and Meek quickly followed suit, abandoning hundreds of pounds of precious provisions across the landscape. The strategy worked. The Blackfoot warriors, upon seeing the scattered meat, immediately halted their pursuit. For them, reclaiming buffalo, taken from their sacred hunting grounds, took precedence over continuing the chase. The meat represented not just food, but a spiritual obligation, returning the sacred gift of the Creator to its rightful stewards. For 20 agonizing minutes, the trappers pushed their horses to the breaking point, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the Blackfoot war party. Only when they reached a dense thicket of pine and aspen did they finally slow their pace. Rose slumped forward in his saddle, his face ashen from blood loss. The right sleeve of his jacket was now completely saturated, blood dripping steadily from his fingertips. "How bad?" Meek asked, eyeing the wound with visible concern. Rose didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained. "The dream. Right arm. The bear knew." The 4 men pressed onward, now 23 miles from Bridger's camp with no food, dwindling ammunition, and one severely wounded companion. What they didn't yet realize was that Rose's injury was even more serious than it appeared. The Blackfoot were known to coat their bullets with a mixture of animal blood, liver, and certain plants that caused severe infection. The poison was already beginning its work in Rose's shattered joint, a complication that would soon threaten not just his arm, but his life. Behind them, 8 Blackfoot warriors gathered the scattered buffalo meat, a small victory in their ongoing struggle to protect their homeland from the ever-encroaching fur trappers. For the warriors, this skirmish was but one minor engagement in a much larger conflict. For Rose, it marked the beginning of a desperate fight for survival that would put the mysterious bear from his dream in an entirely new light. "Meat can be replaced. Men cannot," he said simply. By the 6th day, a remarkable change occurred. The swelling in Rose's arm began to subside. The wound, though still horrific in appearance, showed the first signs of healing at its edges. Rose was able to take broth and keep it down. His periods of consciousness lengthened, and the wild swings between fever and chills became less extreme. 1 week after the ambush, Rose sat up unassisted for the first time. 2 ravens examined the wound and gave a rare smile of approval. The Delaware healer had seen hundreds of injuries during his long life, but few recoveries as surprising as this one. "Strong medicine in your dream," 2 ravens told Rose. "Bear spirit, choose right arm. Now we know why. Rose contemplated this interpretation of his dream. The bear had refused his left hand, insisting on shaking his right, the same arm that would later be grievously wounded. Had the dream been a warning, a prophecy, or merely a coincidence, given significance by desperate men in dangerous circumstances? Whatever the explanation, Rose's recovery continued at an astonishing pace. By the second week, he could walk short distances. By the third, he joined hunting parties, though he still couldn't shoot. The muscles and tendons in his right arm had been severely damaged, and full dexterity never returned to his fingers. But in a profession where a permanently disabled limb often meant death, Rose had beaten overwhelming odds. Some of the trappers attributed his survival to the blood loss that had slowed the poison's spread. Others credited two ravens' remedies. A few whispered about the prophetic dream bear and supernatural intervention. Rose himself never offered a definitive explanation. In his journal, he wrote only, "A man does not question miracles when they appear in his favor." 4 weeks after being shot, Rose was back to full duties in Bridger's camp. His right arm, though weakened and marked by a grotesque scar, functioned well enough for him to shoot, trap, and carry his share of the work. The strange dream of the talking grizzly became part of trapper lore, a story told around countless campfires in the years that followed. What Rose and his companions didn't realize was that their ordeal with the Blackfoot was far from over. The warriors who had ambushed them were merely a small scouting party from a much larger concentration of Blackfoot, who had established winter camp less than 50 miles away. And that camp was about to make its presence known in a way that would threaten not just Rose, but the entire Bridger expedition. Rose had barely regained his strength when a new crisis erupted at Bridger's camp. Maceno, a Mexican scout who had been tracking buffalo movements, burst into the encampment on a February afternoon. Blood soaked his left moccasin, and terror marked his usually stoic features. 3 Blackfoot arrows protruded from his saddle, testimony to his narrow escape. "They're everywhere," Maceno gasped as 2 trappers helped him dismount. An arrow had pierced his ankle, though fortunately without the poison that had nearly claimed Rose's life. Jim Bridger questioned the scout, while the Delaware healer extracted the arrowhead from Maceno's flesh. The news he delivered sent a chill through the entire camp. Blackfoot warriors had established a massive winter encampment just 4 miles south along the Yellowstone River. Nearly 1,000 lodges stood in that location, representing potentially 3,000 warriors. "I counted 50 lodges before they spotted me," Maceno explained, wincing as 2 ravens bandaged his ankle. "Then I saw the rest." The village stretches for nearly a mile along the riverbank. "How did you escape?" Bridger asked, his face grave. 6 warriors chased me north. I jumped my horse down the East Ravine cliff. A 15-foot drop they wouldn't follow. Left my horse half dead at the bottom, but it saved my life." Bridger immediately called his lieutenants together. The situation was dire. 38 trappers faced an overwhelming force of Blackfoot warriors. If discovered, their complete annihilation was virtually certain. "We can't outrun them in this snow," Bridger stated flatly. "Not with our equipment and furs." Within the hour, Bridger had organized his men into teams. Some began felling trees to construct a makeshift fort. Others prepared defensive positions using rocks, snow, and whatever materials they could find. Rose, despite his still healing arm, worked alongside them, helping to sharpen stakes for a primitive palisade. "Build low walls," Bridger instructed. "When shooting, we'll lie flat behind them. Gives less target for their arrows." The men worked through the night without fires to avoid detection. By dawn, a rough fortification had taken shape. A circular defensive position, approximately 60 feet in diameter, with walls 4 feet high. Inside, they constructed small, individual fighting positions, where each man could shelter while reloading. As the trappers prepared for what might become their final stand, against the Blackfoot, Rose found himself examining the scar on his right arm, the same arm the dream bear had insisted on shaking. The coincidence seemed less random now. In the culture of many native tribes, bears represented protection and healing. Had the spirit world somehow reached across the boundary to warn him? Rose never shared these thoughts with his companions. The trappers were hardened, practical men who trusted their rifles more than mystical interpretations. Yet privately, many of them had similar questions. The wilderness had ways of communicating with those who lived within it. Warnings and signs for those attuned to notice. For 3 tense days, the trappers maintained constant vigilance from their improvised fort. Bridger sent out scouts in pairs, who reported the Blackfoot still encamped along the river, apparently unaware of the trappers' proximity. On the 4th day, an unexpected snowstorm descended upon the region, dropping 18 inches of fresh powder that obscured all tracks and trails. Under this natural cover, Bridger made the decision to break camp and move northward, away from Blackfoot territory. The journey proved arduous, but uneventful. By March, Rose and his companions had reached the relative safety of the Three Forks region, where they established a more permanent camp for the remainder of the winter season. Isaac Rose would go on to spend 12 more years in the mountains, before finally returning east in 1848. His journal entries documented dozens more encounters with the Blackfoot and other tribes, some peaceful, many violent. The scar on his right arm remained a permanent reminder of the day he had shaken hands with Lab and survived. The frontier remained a complex tapestry of conflict and coexistence between native tribes fighting to preserve their way of life, and the European-American trappers, traders, and settlers pushing ever westward. The Blackfoot continued to defend their territories fiercely until the devastating smallpox epidemic of 1837 reduced their population by nearly 2/3. By 1850, the fur trade that had brought men like Rose into Blackfoot lands had collapsed due to changing fashion trends in Europe and the depletion of beaver populations. The mountains and plains where Rose once roamed still contain the whispered memories of these encounters. Ancient rivalries have given way to new understandings. The descendants of both Blackfoot warriors and mountain men now work together to preserve the stories of their shared past, not as tales of heroes and villains, but as honest accounts of human beings navigating a changing world according to the values and circumstances of their time. The story of Isaac Rose and his encounter with the Blackfoot is just one of countless forgotten tales from America's frontier past. History isn't just about presidents and generals. It lives in the extraordinary experiences of ordinary people who shaped our nation through courage, struggle, and survival. Subscribe to Histories and Native Tales on YouTube for authentic accounts of indigenous peoples and frontier encounters that textbooks never told you about.